Welcome to Book Bites Episode 5. I'm Adam Garrett Harris, and as usual, my co-hosts are Safia Abdallah. You can go ahead and say hi.
Hey.
Jen Luker.
Hello.
And Jason Staten.
Hi.
So we've been reading and talking about a book called Apprenticeship Patterns for the past few episodes. And today we have a special guest, Dave Hoover, who is the co-author of that book. So welcome to the show.
Thanks.
So tell us a little bit about your background.
My background as an adult is when I graduated from college, I was a psychology major. Wanted to work with kids, like troubled kind of kids going through hard times. So I did that, and I went and got my master's degree in family therapy and worked in that field until I was 26 and enjoyed that work. This was in the late 90s, and by 2000, I was having a hard time keeping my hands out of the web. And in the meantime, because I'd had a baby at a very early age, I needed to earn some extra money. And I got into some HTML to earn some extra money. And that's how I got my start in technology.
So what inspired Apprenticeship Patterns?
It was like getting into Apprenticeship Patterns was kind of it was definitely a winding road. I've always enjoyed writing, and I really enjoyed like blogging in the early 2000s, back when blogging was a kind of a different thing. It was much more decentralized, and I don't know. It was a very different sort of thing, and so I was having a lot of fun starting to blog and get connected to different people that I hadn't been connected to in the past. And it really kind of it took off when I was working at ThoughtWorks. I worked there from 2004 to 2006. And because I got to work there, it opened some doors for me. It kind of was just a little bit of a credential that I hadn't had as a self-taught developer. And so I was able to edit some, kind of proofread some book manuscripts, and I got to write a little column on a website called Sticky Minds. And that column, the idea was that the column was supposed to be about software craftsmanship. And there was a couple other columnists, and the Pragmatic Programmers were two of the other columnists. And I was super fanboy, how can I be a columnist with these people? They'd written the Pragmatic Programmer, Journeyman to Master, right? And so just kind of through the opportunity to write for that column, I realized what am I even qualified to write about? I've only been doing this for 4 years, but I'd read this book called Software Craftsmanship that I'd really resonated with me, and I realized, I know what I could write about. I'm actually only qualified to write about one thing. And that's apprenticeship. Not that I've ever been an actual apprentice, but I know about how to go from nothing to something. I think I'm on the way from apprentice to journeyman. So maybe there's a book there. There's this empty space before the Pragmatic Programmer. That's journeyman to master. Where's apprentice to journeyman? So that's kind of. There's a bunch of different things. There was a blog post that I read, just really short. It was, these days it'd be a 4 tweet storm, or maybe now 2 with these huge character limits that we have these days. But yeah, that was a little blog post by this guy named Chris Morris in Texas, and it was where he was quoting Pat Metheny, the guitarist, with the advice that I loved so much, which was always try to be the worst guy in the band, which I really resonated with me at working at ThoughtWorks, because that was one of the reasons I joined ThoughtWorks back then, was so I could be the worst. So that just kind of kicked off the whole thing. I started writing little blog posts, and I made a little wiki to just start publishing the patterns, and then somebody from O'Reilly kind of stumbled across it and asked me if I wanted it to be a book eventually. And this was in 2005. So that's actually when we got started writing it, was in 2005.
So that actually lends really well into the next question. You talked a little bit about, writing on your own blog, being inspired by different books and other blogs that you were reading as part of the research you put into creating the initial wiki. And then you got reached out to by O'Reilly to write a book. What was the process like with respect to evolving the content you'd produced in the wiki into a formal, professionally edited, professionally published book?
The process, it was very, I don't know, like evolutionary. The thing that, so first I was writing by myself. And so being at ThoughtWorks at the time meant that I was surrounded kind of virtually around the world by a really strong community of software developers who had really strong opinions and were really passionate about their work. And so I could share the stuff that I was writing with people, and they would give me lots of feedback. And I even got to, the coolest thing about that time was I got to get feedback from Martin Fowler, and I was just like, again, fanboying, as I did often when I worked there with certain people. But anyway, early on, there was one guy who would just give me oodles and oodles of feedback, and I could tell that he had a lot of things to say, and that's Ade, ended up being my co-author. So yeah, anyway, the process was pretty organic, but I guess where I was headed with that was I had just read a really large book called A Pattern Language, which is not technical. It's architectural, like real world architecture, and had really just fallen in love with that style of organizing ideas into pattern, of a language of patterns, of interconnecting patterns. And so that was a really interesting process to try to, as well as we could, to fit it into an actual pattern language, so you could kind of link these things together and use them in different varieties. And so Ade and I went to a pattern conference to get formal feedback from people who knew how to do that. And that was really fun. And he and I have only met 3 or 4 times in real life, because he lives in London and I live in Chicago. And that was a really fun time for him to come to Illinois and go through that process. Interestingly, it took 4 years for it to get published, because we did a lot of work in 2005. But then Ruby happened. Specifically Rails happened. And I had to just stop working on the book because there was too big of an opportunity to jump into that space for a while, because it was just really hot and really fun. And I couldn't really come back to it until about 2007 or 8. And yeah, I don't know. We had a wiki. We would just keep putting things out there, get feedback from people. The thing about a pattern language is that it really, for experienced people, they should read it and be like, yeah, that's totally obvious. This is what I did. Or I totally remember doing things like this. Or sometimes there might be something that's novel to somebody, but for a lot of people, it should be somehow feel like conventional wisdom. Otherwise, it's not really a pattern. They should be common solutions to common problems. So we needed to get it in front of a lot of people over some time, and ThoughtWorks, and then our kind of in the community, or our social networks from there that we had, and the authors that we really respected and had reached out to, were all willing to talk to us about this stuff. So we just tried to incorporate that feedback, get as much criticism as we could bear, I guess you could say. And then just push it out. I don't know how else to describe it. It was I think it works best as a wiki. So, because these patterns need to connect to each other, you kind of need hypertext. But anyway, that's kind of how it worked.
So it seems like the book really evolved organically and collaboratively between your own efforts and the network of peers you had at ThoughtWorks and other places at the time.
Yep, for sure. Definitely. And we weren't in any big rush. I was always very mindful of I do not want to write a book that's going to go out of date in 2 years. This is such a pain in the butt to write. It was a lot of work, even though it's barely even a book's worth of content. And I'm I just I don't know how people put out all that content, for highly technical books that get out of date fast, which are really helpful. But like, I was just like, oh, it would be so great if this could still be relevant in like 20 years, because I'm just lazy and I don't want to have to do it again. And yeah, it's held up pretty well. But yeah, we can maybe get to some of the things I'm feeling more and more self-conscious about.
So you said you read that architectural book, A Pattern Language?
Yes.
So I've heard that mentioned a lot when pattern languages are brought up, but I'm curious why you actually read that book.
Well, it goes to one of the, actually, it's not really a pattern, an apprenticeship pattern, but I mean, study the classics is obviously a pattern, but one of the, like, my personal techniques is to do like a depth first search when it comes to book reading. It's kind of fun. It's not necessarily practical, but like when I say depth first, I mean, read a book, look at, like, find the quotes that resonate, figure out where the quotes came from, go read that book, and then like repeat until like you're in some bizarre new territory that now you want to just go back. And you don't have to go that, like, the Pattern Language by Christopher Alexander, if you read the actual like Gang of Four book or any other of the like early patterns books, that was the primary reference. So it's not hard to find. And why I read it is just because I don't know, I'm a reader. I take the train. I live in the suburbs, so I have a lot of extra time to read. And I was just, especially in my first 5 years of my career, I was never not reading. I was somewhat insecure about not being formally educated, and I just wanted to be educated, basically. And I'm also, that was just a really fascinating book. Like, yeah, it's hard to describe, but Christopher Alexander and his co-authors did a lot of interesting work.
Nice. Jason, do you have a question?
I did have one about the break that you took when Rails came on the scene. How do you think that affected the book for you? I mean, on the outcome of it.
Yeah. That did affect some things. What happened was I had left ThoughtWorks in, let's see, I was at ThoughtWorks. Rails kind of hit in 2004. I didn't really see it until 2005 when I started playing with it. I already knew Ruby at the time. Thankfully, I just had picked it up like 3 years before, but like nobody could really get paid to do Ruby. They just, we all thought it was a cool language. But anyhow, like I had this feeling of like, oh wow, this is going to be a big deal. Like Rails is this kind of revolutionary framework, and ThoughtWorks was a little bit slow to pick up on it, and so a bunch of us left, and a lot of us either started businesses or joined very small companies. And that's what I did. I joined a very small company near Chicago and pretty quickly kind of brought Rails into it, which over the next couple of years kind of revolutionized the business or grew the business quite a bit because of all the demand for that technology. And so by the time I was able to bring my head back up, or like, get my head back above water and like think about the book, it was, I was now like in a little bit of a leadership position at the company. And so I still wasn't able to give it as much as I had before. And so eventually I kind of ran out of steam. And at first, Ade and I were like, Ade was kind of like the second author, I guess you could say. But by the end, we were very much like a 50-50. Like he was doing, like, I would say by the end of the book being published, like he had contributed at least as much to it as I had. Because by the end, he finished it. He definitely finished it, whereas I kind of ran out of steam because of my responsibilities at this company called Optiva. So I don't know how that affected the book. It probably made it better because Ade, as much as I read during my early career, Ade is like the most well-read person I've ever met, and is just incredibly diligent sort of person. So I'm sure it made it a bit more rigorous by having him kind of polish everything off.
You mentioned that you found yourself in more of a leadership type position as the later parts of the book were worked on, or I guess later leg of the book. And I know that in the long road, or specifically stay in the trenches, is a pattern that's in there. And I guess what, having been in some of that leadership position, like what are some of the trade-offs that that people should consider before they go into that leadership position versus staying, I guess, further in the trenches?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite topics, actually, because I co-founded Dev Bootcamp back in 2012, and a lot of those students that went through the program are now like 4 or 5 years into their career, 6 years into their career in some cases. And, it's getting to that point where it's very easy for some of them to step out of the trenches. And you have to, if you want to stay, not that everybody needs to. I mean, like, we need leaders, we need executives, and you can stay in the trenches and be a leader, of course. But I think you have to be mindful of timing and opportunity. I got to go to Nigeria recently and visit Andela, this really remarkable company that is in several different African countries. And one of their co-founders is a pretty young guy and a guy from Nigeria, and co-founded Andela just 2 years into his career as a software developer. And like, I would never say like don't take advantage of that opportunity, because Andela is going to like be a kind of a, I think it's going to be a very large company, and it's a very unique opportunity for him. So I would never be like, oh, that's such a shame that now you're not going to be a great software developer or something, because like that's a life altering opportunity. But there's a lot of people who are like, you have an opportunity to like, you can be an engineering manager 2 or 3 years into your career. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you have to understand that it's not risk-free, because by doing that so early in your career, you're going to lose some of what you've gained. And if you stay away, I would say if you're 2 years in your career and then spend 2 or 3 years in management and aren't really coding, you might lose almost all of it to some extent. You're still going to be able to come back and kind of relearn it to some extent. But like, I really consciously tried to stay in the trenches despite a couple different opportunities to kind of move out of it in the first 5 years of my career, simply because I was a little bit older when I started, and like I had, like some soft skills from my psychology background that made it a little, I don't know, just like gave me that opportunity. For me, I was like, no, I switched careers so I could do this. I don't want to do something different. Eventually I did, like at Aptiva, I was like, all right, this is a natural thing. It's 2007. Like, I've been doing this for 7 years. I feel like this is the right time for me to start doing some stuff. And partially it was because like, I wanted to, like, one of the opportunities was like to build a Rails practice. And like, to do that, I needed to go and like actually land gigs and like figure out how to like work with clients to like convince them to use us and get involved in that at that type of level. But anyway, the question wasn't about me. It was but what people need to think about. And that's just that. Yeah, again, it's not risk free. I think the risk is, that you end up, 5 years into your career and you're neither a great programmer nor a great manager. And you can work your way out of that, but you have to be deliberate. There's no other way to say it other than be deliberate. And people can go down the management track and become amazing executives and amazing leaders, or they can, what I've done is I go back and forth. I'll be in leadership, and then I'll like totally abandon that and go heads down again, which is what I'm doing right now. And I really enjoy that kind of diversity of experience of like leading departments or leading a team, and then like having no direct reports and just diving deeply into a new technology and trying to deliver, software to people.
I can understand the kind of pendulum swing of in the trenches, leading a bit and then getting back into it. I'm kind of I've done a little bit myself. One last follow-up on that is, do you, for those who are looking to go into leadership or management, do you have any resources or books you could recommend that help to instill a good culture of apprenticeship within the teams that they lead?
Yeah, I mean, it's all the books that I'm going to recommend are pretty old, and even when I read them, they were old. When I read them like 15 years ago, I would say Jerry Weinberg is one of the best authors about like the people side of technology that's ever lived. Maybe the best. I mean, he's certainly the best. One that influenced me the most. Partially because he has this really fascinating background or like relationship with one of the like pillars of actually family therapy, Virginia Satir, and she really profoundly influenced him. And so for me to find him like as an author was just like really exciting because I had left that career, and then I found this guy that he wrote the book called Psychology of Computer Programming, and that book just like was the book that made me realize like, oh my goodness, like I can actually take what I've learned from my previous career and bring it here. It's not irrelevant. So anyway, so everything by Jerry Weinberg is I don't know, is good, and some of it, and he's probably written over 40 books, so like some of them are going to fit well for people wherever they happen to be. The two that hit me the hardest were Psychology of Computer Programming and Becoming a Technical Leader. I thought those are both great books, and they're both like, geez, I mean, like Psychology of Computer Programming is almost 50 years old at this point. And yet and it was about people using punch cards and stuff, but like I still found it very relevant. One other good one that I really liked was Peopleware by Tom DeMarco. That was a really good book, but again, probably dated it. I mean, some of the book was about like the downsides of cubicles. Today's version of that would be the downside of open workspaces, probably.
Yeah. So you mentioned that the Jerry Weinberg Psychology of Computer Programming book is around 50 years old now. And you mentioned that there were some things that resonated with you from that text. Is there a particular lesson or quote that you still carry with you to this day that you'd like to share with listeners?
I do. I got a little heads up on this question, and I went and grabbed my favorite quote.
Perfect.
Because being me means I'm always writing down quotes because I love quotes so much. Yeah, my favorite quote from that book is, anyone who has seen a programmer at work knows that programming itself, if the programmer can choose their own way, is the biggest motivation in programming. Yeah, and that was huge for me because like I read that like 2 or 3 years into my career, and yeah, the reason I switched careers is because that's what I felt. It was like programming was so much fun to me that it was its own motivation. I just wanted to keep doing it, So I was like, wow, I guess maybe I'm a computer programmer because like if this is a book about psychology of computer programming, it seems like they're talking about my psychology. So yeah, I liked that a lot because I really think even though like there's all sorts of things that we do to get in our own way or just screw up our own motivations, the core of it, of building something that's so free, that has so few limitations on it, is just so much fun. And the key phrase in there was, if the programmer can choose their own way, right? If it's not dictated to them exactly how they need to do their work and exactly what they have to do, which is really just the ability to be creative. You don't really need any extra motivation.
So you mentioned before that you kind of jump back and forth between management and diving into the code.
Mm-hmm.
What patterns do you find yourself going back to again and again?
Be the worst. I've been able to use, I would say, twice pretty effectively. Actually, yeah, it's worked out really well, honestly. Going to ThoughtWorks in 2004 was life-changing, career-changing opportunity. I had no credentials as a self-taught person, and I worked really hard during the kind of .com bust years to educate myself and get to a place where I could go get a job at a place like ThoughtWorks. So that pattern really has worked well. And then I did it again in 2016, I left Dev Bootcamp that year. We had been acquired a couple years before, and long story short, I wanted to go a different way than our acquiring company was taking us. And I dove into cryptocurrencies, and specifically into Ethereum technology. And it was very daunting to kind of really start completely over. It wasn't like learning a new programming language where it's like the same basic stack, but you're just inserting like a new programming language into it. It's like, this is a completely new stack and a whole different kind of paradigm, and all the like design patterns that I knew about like software design didn't really translate. So it was, oh my goodness, I'm starting all over. And so I was able, partially not because of my competence in that field, but because of my credentials, like, you know, having some success, I guess you could say, as a programmer and as an entrepreneur, I was able to get into a company called Consensus, which was kind of like ThoughtWorks, but for Ethereum specifically. And again, I found myself like, you know, raging imposter syndrome. And it's not even a syndrome. I was in some ways an imposter. I was definitely like in over my head, once again, this time with more confidence and more tools and people, like a better network of people to lean on. So it wasn't as scary or overwhelming, but, it certainly was the worst when I was at Consensus. So yeah, that Be the Worst has been awesome. Expose Your Ignorance has always been kind of come somewhat naturally to me. I shouldn't say naturally, but I was just trained as a therapist to do that. And so I've just been trained to be somewhat comfortable exposing my ignorance. So that's always been helpful, because I do think it's one of the fastest ways to learn. I think there's one that I haven't talked about a lot, but it's called Expand Your Bandwidth, which is really just another way of saying like there's certain times when you just have to like open the fire hose and take in a lot of information, and there's other times which, you know, the inverse is that there's other times you need to kind of close it down and just be really productive and like maybe not consume so much information and just output a lot. And that, like, kind of being smart, or at least opportunistic about times when to like consume mass quantities of knowledge versus output lots of software has been helpful. I'm trying to think. I mean, I'm definitely back into like learning mode right now, and I feel like I'm expanding my bandwidth quite a bit. I'm a little exhausted today, to be honest, from it, but in a good way.
So going along with Expose Your Ignorance, what are some things right now that you don't really understand but maybe want to learn?
This was a tough one a couple weeks ago. Cryptography. Yeah, I was sitting down with one of the people I'm working with, and we were talking about different solutions to this problem we're trying to solve, kind of designing the system. And I just had to be open about the fact that like I really don't know much about cryptography and like what it's capable of. He was like putting some stuff up on the whiteboard that I was like, I don't know if it works that way, but honestly, I don't even know how it works. Like, I don't know what it's capable of. You know what? I'm going to take a couple hours and I'm going to like code things up and not like code novel things, but like literally just use existing like node modules in the crypto, or like functions in the crypto node module, and like learn how it works so I could see it for myself. And that was scary because like I just left my previous job and this is a new thing. And I'm the only blockchain engineer in the company. And here I am exposing the fact that I don't even know how cryptography works, or what, not even how it works, but like how do we even apply it effectively? I took a few hours, like I figured it out. I was like, that's amazing. Like, I didn't know you could do that. And I talked to him about it, and it turned out he really liked the fact that I wanted to see it for myself. I wasn't just going to take his word for it, and just nod my head and be like, oh, okay, it sounds good. or pretend like I knew what I was doing. So, boy, that was, it does, I don't know. It does get easier, but it's never not uncomfortable to do it in my experience.
All right. Who else has a question?
Yeah. I was curious to know, it's been more than a decade since the book has been out, or around a decade since the book has been out. In that time, through all the conversations you had with folks at events, online, elsewhere, was there a question or a piece of feedback you got that was really unexpected about the book in particular?
It wasn't a question. I haven't got, I can't think of any like really unexpected questions I've gotten.
It can be a piece of feedback too, or a comment.
Yeah, I mean, there is the biggest thing that I'm more and more conscious of as time goes by, and that is like, maybe it's me changing, but I think it's even more the community that I'm, at least the part of the community that I'm in touch with. But I think it's just a general overall software development community change, is that we're just, as a community, much more aware of privilege now than we were, or at least than I was, back when I was writing this book. And I think it would be interesting to go back through it and examine each pattern and have a little section on its impact on as it relates to privilege or not, or people who are marginalized. Because I mean, geez, like, to be like a 28-year-old white guy saying, "Hey, expose your ignorance," that's a hell of a lot easier to do it as that person than it is if you're not in that demographic, because there's I'm just stereotyped as knowing what I'm talking about to some extent. I even just my age was even like working to my advantage, because I was 28, but I'd only been doing it for 4 years, or 2 years, actually 2 years. So people even assumed even more that I knew what I was talking about. So it just wasn't as risky for me to expose my ignorance or be the worst or do a lot of these things that are somewhat risky to people who, like, if they spoke up, all they're doing is fulfilling a stereotype of not knowing, like, that, like, just the people are going to assume that they know less just because of bias. So that's, especially as I had students, female students coming out of Dev Bootcamp, I was very conscious, or just increasingly conscious of that sort of situation. And one student in particular is just an awesome, strong software development leader, a woman named Lauren Scott. And she's given some talks on, not explicitly about apprenticeship patterns, but about advice that people give. And I think it has, to some extent, kind of given a little bit of a critique to some of these patterns, which I really appreciate. So I think that's the biggest thing I didn't see coming. I'm grateful that it has come to some extent, that we're talking more openly about sexism and racism and privilege than we were, 15 years ago. We still have a long way to go, but that's probably the biggest thing I'd be interested in revisiting or having somebody revisit.
Cool. So do you have any book recommendations along those lines of books about privilege or sexism or racism as it relates to technology and programmers and things like that?
I don't. I'm trying to think. A lot of my thinking on that developed during my time at Dev Bootcamp, when we would do a lot of training on what we called engineering empathy. So I got a lot of my education through the curriculum that Dev Bootcamp created, and at different times, like, trying to actually deliver that curriculum, even though, and learning the lessons at the same time. That was really difficult, and but also enlightening. So I don't have any book recommendations. I'm sure there's some good ones out there. But yeah, most of what I've learned on that front has come through my experience at Dev Bootcamp and through my friendships that I've developed.
Cool. Yeah. The next book we're reading actually relates to this a little bit, and it's called Technically Wrong, and it's about apps and websites that are sexist or racist, or
Technology in general.
Technology in general, they just marginalize people that are quote unquote edge cases. So yeah, I like it so far. Yeah.
Very interesting.
So having had this 10 years of experience beyond this and going in and out of leadership and then helping teach the next generation of developers, what would you change about the book?
Well, other than what I was just talking about, I don't know if there's much else I would change. One thing I was really happy with that that I got through the negotiation with O'Reilly was they agreed to keep it publicly available for free for people. I like I said, I like that the patterns kind of link to each other, and so I personally wanted to be able to link directly to the patterns when I was blogging or tweeting or whatever. So they were really nice to like keep it out there just so that people could read it. It's not easy to read a book just like right on the web, but I was glad that that was out there. As I was I was gonna browse it really quickly before this episode, I realized that they've taken it down. So I might need to go and talk to them about that.
Archive.org save the day for me.
There it is. Trying to think if there's anything else I would change. It would be fun to go back and revisit them and just see if they all still resonate. I just, I looked back through them briefly and I'm pretty happy with them, honestly. I think the long road concept is still very true and it's been interesting for me. I don't think that I'm on that long road. I mean, I have my own road that I'm walking, which is this going back and forth. Like there's other people who are more like principal engineers or like fellows, like people who are like 100% technical and they have been for, decades. That I think is closer to the ideal that we were talking about. I think the sweet spot that I found for myself is a bit more of like somebody who like joins early stage companies and can be a strong technical contributor, but then like grows up with the company and potentially steps away and from the code as time goes on and is in more of a leadership role. We'll see if that plays out again. But I don't know. That's not really answering your question. I guess I'm just talking about myself again. But I don't know. I don't think I have a good answer to like what else would change other than like going back and examining how the patterns relate to privilege and those people who have been marginalized.
So I'm curious to know, you touched on recognizing privilege, which requires a fair bit of empathy, and it got me thinking about your background that you mentioned earlier as a psychologist and then a family therapist. How was the transition like for you from family therapy to software engineering? And do you feel like you utilize a lot of the concepts you learned in your family therapy days to software engineering?
So, yeah, I mean, to answer your first question, like how was that transition? It was really unique and interesting. I went from a field of almost all women to a field of almost all men, and I wasn't even conscious of that at the time. I mean, I was definitely conscious that I would go to work when I was a therapist, and most of my coworkers were women. Anyway, but the cultures are obviously just very different, and the work itself is very different. And at first I was like, okay, well, that's done. I just spent a lot of time and money educating myself on that. But I don't know, I'm just going to trust my instincts. I think, I'm good at this stuff. It seems like, and I'm going to give it a shot. I really enjoy it. And so I just tried to like leave that behind and just be a programmer and just like step into that, whatever I thought that was supposed to be based on like the movies I'd seen or the people I'd kind of worked with or one or two friends that were computer science majors. Then I noticed, the first thing I noticed was in my first job, there was a crisis, like a server had gone down or something, and people were freaking out. And I had just come from a job where like I was working with kids, like one of my last clients, we worked with really intense cases. He was like on the roof of his house, like threatening to like hurt himself. and like that, and that's a crisis. And so I don't know. I was a pretty good crisis counselor. I mean, in the sense that like I could stay calm in like pretty intense situations. And so my perspective on like actual problems versus like technical problems helped me like stay calm, I would say, and like just kind of think more clearly when it came time to like solve problems quickly or triage technical issues. So that'd probably be true for anybody doing any sort of like frontline work in difficult situations, whether you're a firefighter or a Peace Corps worker or whatever. Like just having getting outside of that technical bubble that we live in, where like the worst thing that could ever happen is like a server goes down. So that helped. And then I the thing that did kind of like wake me up to the fact that like my skills were going to be able to translate was reading Jerry Weinberg and then realizing, like, having going through my grad school program and reading about Virginia Satir and reading her work, and then only like a couple years later reading this like person who I thought was like such a great pioneer in computer programming, like literally reference Virginia Satir, was like really exciting for me, because I was like, oh my goodness, I can actually bring these theories with me that I'd learned, and that was really fun and kind of academic. But eventually it just came down to, you know what, like families are a group of people that are trying to do something together, and like they're dysfunctional, and so are teams, and there's just a lot of overlap in like team dynamics and family dynamics. They're definitely very different in certain ways, but I just found it, as I got more into teamwork and eventually into like leadership and management, that the kind of skills that I developed as a therapist, and especially about listening and putting yourself in someone else's shoes, like was really, really helpful, and has made it, I think for the people that I've worked with and people who've worked for me, that's something that they appreciate, is just, I don't know, like some of my background, I guess you could say, in how it plays out in like one-on-ones and how I tend to organize teams. What was there was a second part of your question. I don't know if I answered that yet.
Yeah, I think you did. It was just kind of what are the concepts from your family therapy days that have translated to your software engineering days?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did answer that, probably.
Yeah, I did.
Cool.
So one of the questions I found really fascinating in Study the Classics is, what is the oldest computer science related book that you've read? So I was curious, what's the oldest book that you've read?
Yeah, the oldest, and I've talked about it repeatedly already, because because you guys gave me a heads up on that question, and so I went and looked it up, and then it was interestingly, the oldest book I've read is also the book that I think had the biggest impact on me, which is The Psychology of Computer Programming. That book was written in the 60s. It was published in 1971, and Jerry Weinberg was this like hotshot like computer consultant flying all over the country in the 1960s, like fixing computers and, completing difficult projects. So yeah, that's pretty old. Actually, now that I think about it, I wonder when the Mythical Man Month was published.
Yeah, I actually wrote down all of the oldest books that I want to read here in this book, and the Mythical Man Month was 1975.
Okay, I feel like it's a little bit newer. It was actually published after I was born. Just barely. But yeah, that was all. I really like Frederick Brooks. He has that same kind of mentality of like, when things are working right, like it's bliss. Like when like software development, like, or programming can be kind of blissful. It's not every day, all the time, of course, because sometimes it's hell. But it's the same thing. Like I think he also sees it as a very creative thing when when it's at its best.
Cool. So I think that's about it. Unless anyone else has a question, I think I'll let Jason ask our final question.
So for either listeners of the show or readers of your book, my question for you, Dave, is what action would you like them to take to either help you or help the community in response to hearing these or reading these things?
Yeah, they don't need to help me in any way. What would make me happy is for people to like take their own self-education seriously. I think, the thing that gets me fired up maybe more than anything is people getting fired up about like becoming really good at it, and also just like learning deeply from the people that have already like written so many great things down. There's lots of different ways to read. There's lots of different ways to learn. And some people are going to learn differently than others, obviously. And I am quite a reader. That's not for everybody, but there is so much knowledge that is out there, and it's so valuable. We don't have to learn from our mistakes all the time. We can learn from other people's mistakes. So I hope that, I'm in some ways, I'm really glad my book is short because I want them to like get through it and maybe even only read part of it and find the patterns that work for them and then go like use them. Whether that's making sure that like they're, kind of keeping their passion for the craft, even if their like job kind of sucks right now, or they're like digging into some new topics that's going to like open up new doors for them in the future. I don't know. I just want people to be passionate about what they're doing. And I know that's a privilege, but that's my hope.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for writing the book, and thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. And by the way, you can follow Dave on Twitter at Dave Hoover, and you can follow Ade at Ade_Ashinea. And also, there's a Twitter account for the book. That's at Apprenticeship P. And that's the last week we'll be talking about this book. So that means it's about time to actually give away the 5 signed copies of the book that we have. If you haven't signed up for the giveaway, go do that now. We have 5 copies, so you actually have a pretty good chance of winning one. Just head over to orbit.fm/bookbites/giveaway. And one of the people that entered the giveaway and left a review on iTunes is George. He said, "I've listened to the first 3 episodes so far, and I'm really enjoying it. Great idea for a podcast, and a great opportunity to hear the voices and opinions of developers working today. We really appreciate all the great feedback and reviews we've been getting. You'll have until April 30th to enter to win this book. And next week, we'll have our intro episode for the next book. We're going to be talking about Technically Wrong by Sarah Wachter-Becher. And I'm super pumped about this one. We'll talk about it for 2 episodes, and then we'll chat with the author. We'll also be doing a giveaway for that book as well. So if you enter to win now, you'll be entered to win for the next giveaway as well. You can follow the show on Twitter at BookBitesFM, and you can find the show notes and transcription for the episode as always at orbit.fm/bookbites/5. See you next time.